Electric vehicle, global megatrends.
In 2020, global electric car stock numbered 10 million.
Battery electric vehicles accounted for 2/3 of new electric cars.
Europe overtook China as the biggest market.
Today, several governments provide incentives for EV purchases.
18 of the 20 largest original equipment manufacturers are increasing their EV offerings.
Electric bus and truck registrations are expanding in major markets.
Electric heavy-duty vehicle models are broadening.
Installation of publicly accessible chargers is growing.
Welcome to Elevate Mobility Reimagined, where we'll explore what a successful and attractive South African automotive sector looks like.
Hello, good morning, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar brought to you by NAMSA in partnership with PwC. As highlighted, this webinar is entitled Elevate Mobility Reimagined. Now, it's great to have so many of you that have joined us online for what promises to be a very innovative and informative discussion around the new future of NEVs. New energy vehicles, not only across the world, but also unpacking how we as South Africans can position ourselves for this competitive market. So on that note, it's a very good morning to you, and thank you once more for joining us. I'm Gugulethu Mfuphi, and I'll be hosting your webinar for today as we journey along this transition that looks to inform us on the developments that take place in the upcoming weeks. Well, October will see the staging of the inaugural South African Auto Week, which is scheduled for the 24th to the 30th of October 2022. Now, this event is the automotive industry's premium networking and thought leadership conference, which will embrace several activities revolving around the 3-day Auto Thought Leadership Indaba, which will commence on Wednesday, the 26th of October until Friday, the 28th of October, 2022. So if I were you, I'd be making preparations to make sure that those dates are set aside, to make sure that you are able to actively participate in the Indaba. Speaking of which, it will be taking place at the Kyalami International Convention Center, and those of you wishing to join us there physically or virtually, please be sure to visit the SA Auto Week website, which will be available online from next week, Thursday, the 1st of September. There, you'll be able to find more details, insight, and of course, the necessary details that will allow you to register and participate. Now, as a reminder, the theme for the SA Auto Week for 2022 is Reimagining the Future Together. The rise of the African auto industry, investing in new energy vehicles, infrastructure, and people. So you might be asking yourself, how does today's webinar fit into all of this as we're months away from the inaugural Auto Week? Well, in the run-up to the South African Auto Week, NAMSA in partnership with PwC are hosting 2 webinars. Today's one, and of course the second one entitled Engage, Pathways for South Africa's Transition to NEVs. Now, both of these webinars and the conversations that will be distilled here have been crafted around the Auto Week theme and strategic pillars and feature international and local industry experts, making sure that we tackle the top key themes and conversation areas that are required for us to build up the excitement and the opportunities that exist around this particular arena. Now, today we'll also hear from a keynote speaker, but we'll also have a very insightful panel where 4 industry leaders, both from South Africa and across the world, will join us to bring their unique and well-informed insight. But of course, given that this is part of engagement and making sure that we all source solutions that lead us to a greater future, today's webinar does allow you the opportunity to pose your questions to the panel. So whilst we might be in a virtual world, you're always welcome to interact and engage. So do be sure to jot down your questions, any particular themes, as you hear from the various keynote speakers, as you engage in the panel discussion, and of course, jot down your questions towards the webinar. We'll be able to address your questions to some of our speakers to further unpack much more of their insight. Well, we've got the engine running. The tires, I think we've kicked, and it seems as though they're sufficient enough to get us by. But what we need to do now is to shift into first gear, as we're about to welcome our first speaker for today, Mr. Michael Mabasa, a transport economist who currently serves as a council member of the International Organization of Motor Vehicle Manufacturers. He also serves as the chairman of the Automotive Industry Exports Council and a member of the board of the Energy Council of South Africa. As an aviation specialist in his own right, Michael Mabasa previously chaired the Air Services Licensing Council. He's also served as the chairman of the board of the Air Traffic Navigation Service and was a member of the International Air Services Council. Michael is addressing us today, though, in his capacity as the Chief Executive Officer of NAMSA. To allow us to introduce our first keynote speaker, let's shift gears and speak to Michael Mabasa. Mr. Mabasa, good to have you with us in the hot seat today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Fantastic. I'm hoping I'm using all the right terminology. We're shifting gears, the engine is warm, now to make our way down the highway.
You have the script right. Absolutely right.
Fantastic. Well, there's a great sense of excitement, right, Michael, as we make our way to SO Auto Week. And I guess many might be asking themselves the questions as to how these engagements actually connect us into the greater scheme and theme of what it is that we're trying to achieve.
Absolutely, Gugu. Look, the South African automotive industry is a very important sector to the economic life of our country. We are very clear that the future is changing very, very quickly. It is actually arguably going to change faster in the next 10 years than it has in the last 100.
Sure.
Now, in order for us to be able to adapt to this change, we need South Africans to rally. We need industry to come together so that we can really be able to find ways of how best are we going to work together to make sure that this evolution, as it comes through, we are able to make sure that South Africa is ready, because we are competing. South Africa is currently the 21st biggest manufacturer of vehicles globally.
Sure.
And we really want to position ourselves strategically so that we can be able to make sure that as we enter the evolution and the production of new energy vehicles, we are absolutely ready and we are able to take our rightful place to participate actively in that evolution.
I like that. You say we're taking up our rightful space, which means that we, as you say, well positioned. So as we sit on the precipice of this great opportunity, SA Auto Week also incorporates a lot of interaction, though, from our international counterparts. Help us unpack that and understand how that might help us push forward in our endeavors. Absolutely.
So we are very, very lucky. I serve on the International Organization for Automobile Manufacturers globally, which is OICA. We were very lucky this year that we were able to persuade the council to consider bringing OICA to South Africa. Awesome. So for the first time in the history of that organization, OICA is coming to Africa. And South Africa will be hosting about 39 different countries in the country during that particular week. And we obviously want to learn a lot from them. We want to be able to bring those insights into South Africa so that we can really be able to make sure that we are able to empower South Africans as we journey into this very exciting trip.
We'll get into some of those insights as we also make reference to the PwC report, but give us a quick I guess, highlight and overview of the kind of interactions that will take place there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the SA Auto Week is structured in such a way that we'll obviously have some keynote addresses from different speakers. We've invited quite a number of high-level speakers. We are certainly going to be announcing some of those speakers officially, hopefully on the 1st of September when we launch the website. But there's certainly 7 very key strategic topics that we're going to be focusing on, ranging from, for an example, the impact of COVID-19. So the sector, as you may be aware, was impacted hugely by COVID-19 in the last 18 months. So we want to really take stock and reflect on what impact COVID-19 has brought into the sector. And for us, obviously, South Africa, we've seen, for an example, shortages around semiconductors. We've seen the floods in the KZN. We've seen disruptions in terms of the unrest last year in June. We've seen also quite a number of other seismic changes in the last 18 months. So we really want to reflect specifically on how that topic has in fact impacted on the sector. Secondly, we also want to look at the just transition conversation. How is the sector ready to be able to pivot into a net zero commitment, because our president, our government, and we're very lucky also that we've got a very strong ambassador in our Minister of Trade and Industry, who is really a very strong advocate for the EV evolution. And we are working very fantastically with him so that we can really be able to make sure that we're able to accelerate our agenda quite very fast. So the net zero debate is going to also be center of our discussions. We're also going to look at soft issues. Skills, for an example, development is very key, because as we move into the production of new energy vehicles, we want to make sure that the people that we currently have on the shop floor are also trained to be able to do the right thing as we move into the automotive industry. And we're also working with our universities so that they can also change and translate that curriculum so that they are ready as well to be able to make sure that they help us to move.
It sounds like quite a wide partnership that incorporates a wide array of stakeholders who are involved here. But I do want to bring it back to the South African economy. You touched on some of the threats and the concerns that we've experienced, but remind us as to why it is that the automotive industry remains so critical to bolster and even propel South Africa's economic recovery, given the role it plays.
Absolutely. Look, the automotive industry is actually the lifeblood of the economy. Without this sector, we will not be able to move from one point to the next.
Literally.
Literally. We will not be able to transport goods and services. Your bread that you get every morning will not be able to be on your table, because the truck that needs to bring that bread to your table will not be able to move. We're obviously contributing immensely to the South African economy. The contribution of the industry to the gross domestic product currently sits at around above 5%. And we certainly want to be able to accelerate that particular contribution. Our president has already spoken about industry coming together, or different industries coming together to support government, because I think days are gone where we should actually sit back and wait for government to pretty much do everything for us. And I think as a sector, what we've now decided to do is to really bring our best foot forward and support government, and really be able to make sure that we're able to make sure that South Africa is able to recover in terms of its own economic growth ambitions.
I find that so refreshing, because it's a strong message to our audience members and participants joining us today that we're here to engage, and ultimately that will lead us to elevate the role and function and contribution of the automotive sector. Well, we're looking forward to this and so much more that will come out of NAMSA, and of course the ongoing partnerships as we make our way to the Automotive Week in South Africa.
Absolutely.
Thank you again for your time, sir.
Thank you very much, Gugu.
Fantastic. Well, favorable insights that we heard there from Michael, right? And I think really sets the tone for the conversation that we're going to explore, not only in today's webinar, but in many of the conversations that will unfold in the weeks to come. And as a reminder, today's webinar is really about exploring and interrogating a fascinating and very topical subject for the average South African, and indeed the continent overall, specifically when it comes to our automotive industry, both the current as well as the future landscape of NEVs, challenges, opportunities, and a potential roadmap going forward. So I hope that this has already intrigued you and provide you with great insight as to what you can look forward to for the remainder of today's webinar. And most importantly, share your positioning as a key player and stakeholder in the automotive space. What would you like to see us address? What concerns do you think we should address quite adequately? And most importantly, how do we keep the excitement going to make sure that we are taking advantage of this key opportunity that exists for the moment? A reminder to share your thoughts with us, and of course, keep your feedback coming. We will address it in the latter half of today's webinar. Well, moving on to our next speaker now, as we off-ramp into another alley, this time around to get a more global perspective of what is unfolding when it comes to the motor environment across the globe. Well, our next keynote speaker is Harold Wimmer. He is PwC's global and European automotive industry leader. His primary focus is on bringing the best of the global PwC network together. He also co-leads PwC's smart mobility businesses, which includes EV, batteries, AV, intermodal transport, among others. He has profound industry expertise through numerous engagements with clients, along with the entire automotive value chain. Now, Harold's mission is to serve PwC automotive clients with the very best possible expertise worldwide by bringing together a community of solvers with rich sector expertise and capabilities from across territories. I'm looking forward to this conversation, giving us a global perspective on the dynamics we're likely going to experience. Let's warmly welcome Harold.
Hello everyone, I'm Harold Wimmer and PwC's automotive leader. I feel honored to have been given the opportunity to address you with a keynote at this webinar leading up to the South Africa Auto Week in October. I understand that South Africa currently acts as a manufacturing hub for OEMs in order to support building their export markets, primarily the EU, the US, and the UK. Manufacturing in South Africa is currently very much focused on internal combustion engine powered platforms. In order to sustain relevance in the global automotive industry, it appears paramount to understand how the markets which South Africa is currently producing for are developing towards EV mobility, what the expected timeline is, and what is needed to ensure that the automotive industry in South Africa remains relevant, even in the world of electric vehicles. Hence, in this keynote, I provide a brief update on the trends in the automotive industry, shed some light on technology adoption, provide a view on the pace of EV transition, look at some challenges and successes in the rollout of EV charging infrastructure, present some opportunities inherent in these developments for South Africa. Mobility is about the transportation of people and goods and is an important pillar of the prosperity of our society. However, mobility is generally undergoing a massive change driven by metaforces. Metaforces leading to the change we observe in the industry: climate change, consumer demand and behavior, rapid urbanization, and technology innovation. Technology innovation in the automotive industry is generally summarized under the acronym CASE, standing for Connected, Automated, Shared, and Electric. Electric does currently have the most significant impact on the automotive industry. The changes are enabled through maturing technologies along with regulation, economics, and customer adoption. Adoption of new technology starts slow. The pace of adoption grows exponentially when the technology results in lower cost or more revenue than the incumbent technology, and the so-called tipping point is reached. Battery electricity is the most energy-efficient fuel to decarbonize mobility once derived from renewable energy. If derived from renewable energy, battery electricity-powered vehicles require only 18 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometer range, where a hydrogen fuel-powered vehicle requires 3 times more energy, and a synthetic fuel-powered vehicle consumes more than 6 times as much energy for the same distance. The decarbonization of mobility is happening worldwide at different speeds, yet far too slow everywhere if we want to meet the climate Paris goals. Frontrunners are Europe, China, India, and the US, with Canada following 2023 and South Africa expected to follow in 2028. The speed of the change is driven by emissions regulation, subsidies, and taxation of petrol prices. In order to measure and compare the readiness of countries for e-mobility, PwC developed an e-readiness index on 14 KPIs that were clustered in 4 main dimensions. The 4 main dimensions for e-readiness are government incentives, infrastructure, supply of EVs, and demand for EVs. Against this background, Norway is the most EU-ready country across all dimensions, while France, Italy, Spain seem the least mature countries for e-mobility. When it comes to reasons why customers buy an electric vehicle, vehicle cost, environmental impact, and the ease of charging at home, are the leading factors. Key inhibitors to buy electric vehicles instead are high upfront cost, limited range of driving, and charging time. In order to seriously drive adoption by customers, huge investments in charging infrastructure is needed by a multitude of market participants across various industries in order to build the required EV charging infrastructure ecosystem. Market participants required to contribute primarily are auto OEMs, electric vehicle supply equipment providers, utilities, retail partners, fleet managers, and governments. EV charging ecosystem stakeholders face a multitude of challenges and opportunities at the same time, which require immediate action. Incumbent players need to redesign their business strategy, work hard on transforming their corporate culture, attract talent which was previously not relevant for their business, partner with players from industries they previously were not associated with, and find solutions for significant amounts of stranded assets. While there is a growing pool of players that are new to the automotive and mobility space, and which are very aggressively positioning themselves in order to participate in the value pools that result from the formation of EV charging ecosystems. Opportunities inherent in these developments for South Africa are in the localization of supply chains in general, in becoming the internal combustion engine manufacturing base for OEM, serving all markets that are situated in economically less mature countries, where mobility will be dependent upon internal combustion engines for the foreseeable future. And becoming a leading supplier of battery raw materials by re-establishing or providing mining and refining capacities that are currently predominantly residing in China. Last but not least, the general need for energy generated from renewable sources is a big opportunity. Many thanks for your attention. Enjoy the webinar.
Harold, you've whet our appetite, and I must tell you, many of us are looking forward to deep diving into those compelling insights that you've shared around the state of play around the world. And this is where we are going to, again, shift gears to participate in our panel discussion. I'll be introducing key industry leaders, both locally and from abroad, who'll be giving us some details and, of course, some facets that we need to consider as we adequately prepare to take advantage of this opportunity that will allow us to transition within the automotive space. Join us for this conversation. Well, this is where we're going to add meat to the bones, right? To make sure that we're able to distill much of the factors that we do need to consider and understanding both from a local and international point of view as to how it is that we speak to the various facets that were highlighted in Harold's presentation. Supply, demand, government incentives, and the necessary infrastructure that's required. Well, as you can tell, I'm not alone, but joined by a good colleague who's going to assist us in this conversation, together with three more who will be participating in today's panel discussion. So let's get the show on the road by introducing our various speakers who will give us some details and insight over the next 40 minutes into some key opportunities that we need to take advantage of. Allow me to introduce my virtual speakers and guests first. A reminder that this is a webinar, so if at any point in time you happen to experience any technical disruptions, please do bear with us. We're literally connecting a number of guests from all over the world, so feel free to reconnect, reestablish your line, and on our end, our technical team has done everything to the best of their capabilities to ensure that all of our speakers will be with us online. But that will not deter us from hosting this bold conversation. A reminder that we do have our four panelists joining us, and again, welcoming Harold Wimmer, who is PwC's Global Automotive Industry Leader, who we heard from just a moment ago. Good to have you with us today, Harold, and looking forward to the conversation. Harold is not alone. Our second panelist is Gaylor Montmasson Clare. Senior Economist at Trade and Industry Policy Strategies, or TIPS. Now, Gaylor leads TIPS work on sustainable growth. He's also a research associate at the University of Johannesburg's Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development. He holds 2 master's degrees, both from France, and Gaylor has been working on green economy issues for more than a decade and has carried out extensive research on the transition to an inclusive green economy from a developing country perspective. Gaylor, good to have you with us, or should I say bonjour?
Bonjour, indeed.
Good to have you with us this morning, Gaylor. Looking forward to your participation. Our third panelist this morning for the conversation is Heiko Sitz, the e-mobility leader of PwC Germany and PwC's global charging infrastructure leader. Now, Heiko has more than 17 years of experience within mobility as well as energy sectors. An internationally experienced strategy and implementation leader, Heiko is a trusted advisor to governments and industry C-suites as he guides decision makers on major energy and mobility corporations along their decarbonization, electrification, and digitization agendas. Heiko, welcome to you and thank you for your time. Fantastic.
It's great to be here. Hi, Guguleto.
Fantastic. Good to have you with us. And our final guest who joins me here, warm bodies in studio. He's our backup plan in case there's any technical gremlins. I'm teasing, I do. But of course, our fourth panelist is Hiten Palmer, Director of Uyilo E-Mobility Program South Africa, a leading executive and thought leader, an industry expert with more than 18 years of experience. Hiten is a director of South Africa's National Electric Mobility Program, where he delivers the mandate of enabling and supporting the uptake of electric mobility across both public and private sectors. He also serves as liaison for multiple sector-related forums within South Africa, as well as internationally on advancing the electric mobility ecosystem. Hiten, thank you so much for your time.
Great to be here.
Good to have you with us, together with our other panelists who are joining us virtually this morning, as we look to participate in transition and fully understand the opportunities that lie ahead within the next decade or so. And speaking of which, you two are not limited from participating in this conversation, so please do make notes of the questions that you do have. In the latter part of this webinar, we will be able to address your questions with our panelists to share some more insight. Well, let's get some clarity on this, right? One thing we know for sure is that there's a world of opportunity that awaits. The demand is increasing for us to evolve from an EV point of view. And of course, we just need to ensure that we are fully capacitated, both from a South African, and global point of view. And perhaps, Harold, you've set the tone in terms of the themes, the countries, and the driving factors that are leading us on this charge. But Heiko, I'm keen to come to you. To address us with our opening question, as we look at the theme of mobility, look at many of the themes that are accelerating this evolution to EV. Help us unpack from your perspective how you see this transitioning at a faster rate than what we've anticipated before, and the kind of influences that this continues to play within the automotive space at large. Heiko?
Yeah, Guguleto, absolutely. The EV transition is happening. It's happening now, and it's happening actually really, really fast, as we see in different markets that have started to engage this whole electrification journey. As Harald showed us earlier, the electrification of traffic around the world is happening in phases, so geographic phases. And that is very much, Harald already mentioned it a little bit, very much driven by policy and regulation. So policy can have a positive incentivization for investment in e-mobility, so in the vehicle side of e-mobility, as well as on the infrastructure sides. And you can do that obviously by subsidies, but then obviously policy can also have negative incentivizations to, let's say, restrict or lead away from the use of hydrocarbon fuels by especially taxing petrol and CO2 emissions. So when we look at that, battery or, well, let's say non-hydrocarbon energy sources become more attractive. And I found this graph really interesting that Harald just showed, right? So basically, battery electric e-mobility is 6 times more energy efficient than e-fuels. It's 3 times more energy efficient than hydrogen. So we will see that the transition to battery electric mobility will, for those regions in the world that want to really decarbonize, have to be the most preferred choice wherever the use case allows. And it's just fair to say battery electric mobility doesn't work for everything. So there are some use cases where batteries don't work and where they do. But then again, when you look at the prices, the majority of a price from an EV as we see today is very much driven by the price tag of a battery. And the cost for battery production has come down by approximately 90% over the last 12 years. So a very popular model that we see produced in California right now, like a Tesla Model Y, for example, would have costed probably $80,000 more 12 years ago than it does cost today. So we see the prices become more affordable. The technology is almost reaching parity. We believe that in 2025, so in very short time from now, there is an absolute price and technology parity, and that will be reflected in a continuation of the exponential growth of EVs across the world. You can just look at EU or China, and the order books are full beyond short term. For me, the key message here is summing up: if policy and regulation sets the right stimulus, then the transition to electric mobility happens, and it happens then suddenly very fast.
Definitely. And policy, as you say, is a key catalyst for much of that development there. And Heiko, you've added to the theme and the tone from a global point of view, but I'm keen to get a South African perspective, and perhaps Hiten, this is where you can share some insight as to how we see this impacting and transitioning from a South African point of view.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the interesting point to reflect on is that South Africa's journey towards electrification from a product perspective started in 2005. That's when we had the first hybrid electric vehicles. We then evolved into that to 2013, where we had the first battery electric vehicle, and then the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle from 2015. So that's been South Africa's journey. I think today, status quo, we are not even 2,000 vehicles on full plug-in electric vehicles, and this is the challenge within that. So we heard about scenarios on policy environment, what is the labeling framework. These are all supporting mechanisms that we need to see in South Africa's environment develop. I think we have to acknowledge our green transport strategy that was launched in 2018. Strategic Pillar 8 speaks to promotion of hybrid electric vehicles. So that's the enabling frameworks that we have currently in play in terms of that. I think what's important is we had the introduction of where is South Africa's automotive manufacturing industry, and we need to look at how do we evolve that into the emerging technologies. And I think this is what we're going to see unfold from the Department of Trade and Industry in the revisions that are coming out into transforming the manufacturing value chain, because that's what's critical for South Africa to transition. But we do have activity on the ground in the market on electrified vehicles, which is interesting.
Got you. And I think it's refreshing to hear that from a policy point of view. And as you say, the innovation does stem back a while back, 2005. Before I come to Gaylor to get some of his insight as well, I'm keen to understand from your perspective first, Hiten, from a policy point of view, are we transitioning in the right direction? And are we seeing that there's a great sense of optimism to actively participate in this transition?
Indeed. So I think every market is unique. There's opportunities and threats with that. But what's important is the enabling environment from government. So if we take a step back, we look at our NDP, our National Development Plan of 2030, there's a commitment towards achieving specific frameworks, by 2030 in terms of that. Supporting other frameworks beyond that, we're speaking of the green transport strategy that creates that. So we've got that mechanisms. I think what's going to really accelerate it is looking at, the incentives for looking at manufacturing, and that's what's really going to drive that, but also leveling the current dynamics on import duties so that no technology is disadvantaged from that perspective. So that's what will change the scenario. I think other countries have created stronger in environments for uptake of the technologies where they don't have certain dynamics from a manufacturing sector to manage, and that's where they've literally leapfrogged and created that. I think Norway is a critical example in the region between 78% of new car sales are electric, and that's where it is, but it doesn't have a local manufacturing industry to manage from that. So these are the dynamics. The other thing is also important is looking at government's revenue from a fiscal point of view to be able to subsidize the transition. So these are the things that we need to take into consideration in South Africa as well.
And speaks to a great opportunity that does exist there. Gaylo, I'd like to get your thoughts in here, especially perhaps, referencing what we're seeing from an international point of view and using Norway as an example. Are there best practices in terms of policy that South Africa is already considering or should be put on the table further for us to deliberate on?
Of course, I think we've got to acknowledge the global dynamics and the global environment. And for me, it was really striking in Errol's presentation, that the number one driver for EV adoption, but also the number one inhibitor, is cost. In both cases, so it tells you one thing: it's all about managing that cost. And what's clear from international experience around the globe is that incentives are required of some form to reduce the purchasing price of EVs. EVs are much cheaper to run than internal combustion engine vehicles, but they're still, in many cases, more expensive to purchase. So it's how we manage that upfront cost that matters. And I think from a South African perspective, that bears important lessons, because EVs are still quite expensive to purchase. And we do need some sort of incentive to reduce that purchasing cost.
Gotcha.
Of course, we can't just take what's happened in Europe and copy paste. We have very different circumstances, in terms of car ownership and of course widespread, inequality, and we need to make sure that the rollout of e-mobility is inclusive. So that there's some important lessons in terms of how we think about it, but certainly some sort of framework that will incentivize buyers to turn themselves to EVs is critical going forward.
Definitely. I do want to open up the conversation to the rest of the panelists, so feel free to raise your hands and jump in there if there's critical points that you'd like us to add on to. But Harold, I'd like to go back to you, just to build up some themes. Heiko, your hand has been acknowledged there, but I do want to bring Harold into the conversation just briefly in terms of the global dynamic and transitioning that to the opportunity that it creates again for South Africa as a key manufacturing hub. But Harold, one thing that you did touch on very briefly in your presentation was, of course, the global supply chain disruptions. Michael touched on it in his opening address. So we're well aware that these continue to present a number of challenges in the short to medium term regarding how promptly and how effective we are in terms of manufacturing and transitioning to EV. Set the tone there and the theme for us, as I would like to bring it back to the opportunity that it creates and presents to South Africa to perhaps shift gears and improve on its manufacturing capacity within this space. But Harold, your thoughts on the global dynamics regarding supply chain disruptions and the concerns that it places on the automotive space.
Yeah, thank you very much. The supply chain disruptions, amongst other, driven by chip shortages, by wire harness shortages, and the shutdowns in certain key markets, I think they led to one particular thing, right? Everybody has become very much aware how vulnerable the supply chain setup is as we currently run it, right? I don't see this really putting a particular strain on the development of electric vehicle progression, right? It affects EVs and ICEs at the same time, right? So I think no significant risk particular to electric vehicles coming into our lives there. However, the vulnerability that they all suffered from now has led to a much better understanding and a lot more sensitivity around, a balance that needs to be achieved between cost effectiveness and resilience at the same time, right? And when you look at this against the background of the geopolitical tensions that we see in play right now, and that might come going forward, I think this is one thing where I see both the players in the industry and governments really already now take action in order to incentivize players to place investments into politically more stable countries in order to reduce the existing dependency on certain countries.
On that one. So good news is that there won't be any short-term disruptions, as you say, but we do need to be cognizant about improving and increasing the basis for vehicle manufacturing there, or rather also the various parts, right? And this is where South Africa wants to beef up on its opportunity here. And perhaps, Hiten, I can come back to you, and of course, still opening this up to many panel members to share some of their views. But this then speaks to how South Africa, as a key region and key market, number 21 on the list, as we heard from Michael, in trying to propel its positioning as a manufacturing hub. Now, I'm hoping that you can distill this both for the benefit of our international audience and ourselves, right? Because so often we're plagued by load shedding, lack of incentives, lack of support, supply chain disruptions, shortages at the port. And at times we can find ourselves being bogged down by these realities, but there's still opportunities that exist nonetheless.
Indeed. So I think we've had some insights of where we are today, but I think where we need to be, especially the South African Automotive Master Plan of 2035, and achieving 1% of global production, is NEVs are going to be part of that. So how are we going to transform that from a manufacturing perspective into that? So we need to look at the mechanisms in play to really drive battery manufacturing and really unpacking the value chain of new energy vehicles in terms of that. So we have already a very well-established automotive component manufacturing supply chain, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, that is a global outreach into that, including the technologies for NEVs. What we need to now see is how we're going to incentivize that in South Africa, because really all the global players are here because of the incentives from that. So this is what we need to see coming into play.
What would work top of mind for you, though, in terms of those incentives?
Directly, I think it's, and this is some of the conversation that sees that this is where the playing field is currently. But what we need to do is obviously create some sort of carrot approach to incentivize new technologies over, ICE technologies from that perspective, from a component manufacturing. I think that's what's going to really drive that, because you've got the technology growth, but also the job creation knock-on effect from that perspective. And that's what's key, because, we need to now have that signal coming into play in the market to drive that uptake, because it's really going, it's not the imports that are going to drive South Africa's growth. It's going to get the cars on the road, but when you look from an economic perspective and social impact, it's what's local production and development of that ecosystem that's really going to grow that. So when you speak about energy, yes, load shedding is a very, very topical point on this subject, but let's not forget that the strengthening of the grid is actually being catapulted because of the chaos from load shedding.
Yes.
So when you look at that, South Africa, for example, on renewable energy, South African market was within the top 10 in 2021 for residential energy storage systems because of that, and that's what drove it. So what we're seeing is load shedding actually in certain cases strengthen the grid alongside the national utility, but that now also extends that envelope for charging of electric vehicles, because most homeowners currently already have rooftop solar, and major businesses are also transitioning into the energy space as well. So when we take a step back, we see that our grid has actually been strengthened from load shedding to support the transition to electric vehicles.
Got you. And if anything, that should provide the international market with a greater sense of confidence, right? To say, okay, well, there is additional capacity that's being put in place to ensure that there's sustainability to these operations. Heiko, I believe that you did have a hand up earlier, and I'm actually intrigued to pull through some of your views, right? Because as listed in your bio, you speak to industry leaders, you speak to governments, you speak to clients and C-suite executives with regard to the theme around mobility. So you might be best positioned to help us understand what is it that you would witness automotive leaders need from a market like South Africa in order for it to maintain its competitive advantage, given the backdrop of what has been highlighted by Hiten?
Yeah, there are. I mean, it's such a huge pool, and there are so many considerations. So it's probably difficult to sum them all up. But I would like to comment on something that is also something to be really considered in the boardrooms. Sure. Would like to comment on something that Gaylor said, and Gaylor, you absolutely mentioned that cost drives EV adoption, right? You have to make the purchase of e-mobility attractive and also affordable for the masses. And right now we see a trend, especially in some regions of the world, in Europe, etc., to focus more on the premium segment of electric vehicles. And I really see a risk that in some parts of the world, e-mobility is shaped to become a privilege of the more wealthy part of the population. Now, I'm very convinced this would also be an issue for the market of South Africa. So e-mobility may not be privilege for wealthy. It must become a commoditized product for the masses. Only that way you can also achieve the scale of e-mobility to make it work for investors, because you need high demand on the charging side, etc., to make it a worthy investment and therefore really create the ecosystem. So that is something where I already see, and I think Harald and Gaylor, everybody already has their hands up. We see a trend towards a, let's say, expansion of the price range in the production segment across the board. But I think that is really key. We need to make sure that e-mobility becomes affordable, because it's a basic right. Mobility is a basic right and basic need for everyone. And we need to assure that in the target model, in the sustainable target model of the future, where we want to develop mobility towards, everybody has a space.
Definitely. I'm going to open it up to the panel just in case Gail or Harold do want to share some perspective, but I'm also going to throw a spanner into the works there, right? Because given the current energy crisis we see happening globally, I guess the tensions between Russia and the Ukraine, this further adds uncertainty and exacerbates the concerns regarding cost effectiveness due to access to energy, right? And of course, that pricing transition, does that potentially further delay or add to considerations that we need to keep in mind when it comes to the transition for EV? Gaylor, perhaps let me throw that one at you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, let me first, I think, just rebound on the discussion, and really the imperative of making sure that the transition to e-mobility is inclusive and benefits all. I think it's really fundamental, particularly in South Africa. We only have about a third of households that can afford a car, let alone an EV. So I think if we want to bring everyone along, we need to be careful to frame our support towards, I would say, entry-level vehicles, entry-level EVs, as well as public transport. And I think that's, in South Africa, really critical that we also bring e-mobility to buses and minibus taxis, so that everyone effectively has access to the technology. And I think, just to your point, we should not let us be deterred by short-term dynamics and volatility. The transition is unfolding. Yes, there is volatility in the market, and that creates some challenges for some time. But we should not hold and say, oh, well, we can only transition once, we've solved all our problems. Once we've solved load shedding, well, all the global market is sorted. If we do that, it will be too late. Yeah. We will miss, the electric vehicle transition. We must start, and then it will accelerate in time.
Got you. And I think that's a very valid point that you mentioned. We need to start and we need to catapult and catch up. But Gaylor, just to stick with you for a moment, and hopefully this does also speak to the themes that other panelists will address. From a South African point of view, OEMs are positioned looking more at the export market, right? Great opportunity. So we do need to make sure that we have sufficient supply to meet the demand from an international point of view. But there's also some concerns and considerations that you've listed from a local aspect. So I'm keen to understand, as we strike a balance for policies that suit a market like South Africa, a developing economy with unique fundamentals and themes that speak to it. How do we strike that balance, linking in back policy, linking in back supply and demand from a local and international point of view that will speak to the right policies that will assist us in accelerating this transition?
Yeah, 100%. I think you really put it so well. The South African market is both relying on local demand as well as the export market. And that makes things a little bit more complicated, but not impossible. And what we need to see, I think, is a framework that's going to support a degree of local demand, because it is important for local industry, we've been doing a lot of work and trying to understand the level of support that would be required, particularly for entry-level EVs. And we think that can be achieved, either through some sort of purchasing subsidy or even playing with interest rates, which are quite high in the South African market. We also need to address the anomaly that have been mentioned already by Ethan around the tariff for EVs. That's critical, particularly to support the entry of cheaper vehicles into the South African market. And then I think we can play with the existing policy framework, the APDP, the Automotive Production Development Program, which is by many respects, the crown jewel of South Africa's industrial policy, supporting the automotive industry. We can tweak it mildly to make sure that we incentivize our current 7 OEMs to invest in their manufacturing capabilities to transition to EVs, so that they can tap, of course, on the local market, but importantly, into the export market. We must remember that most of the vehicles exported by South African OEMs are going to Europe, and that market is transitioning fairly rapidly to EVs. So we do have to keep in check what's happening in the EU. So I think some interventions on the demand side to spur the local market, particularly for entry-level vehicles, and supporting the manufacturing side by tweaking slightly the existing framework. We're not talking about changing everything. It's been working for a long time. It's something that's been well developed between government, industry, and labor unions, but tweaking it mildly to support the development of EV-specific components like batteries, like the electric drivetrains, and so forth, and also to support new investment in manufacturing lines would really position us well into the future.
Definitely. And I think refreshing to hear that, as you say, in terms of positioning South Africa from a manufacturing point of view with some of its international counterparts. Heiko and Harold, I'd like to come to you here. As we've heard, policy and government incentives does play a critical role in catapulting the advancements towards EV. And Heiko, you have the benefit of sharing some suggestions and recommendations in terms of learnings, I believe, from what we've seen when it comes to the necessary infrastructure, such as charging pods, stations, and of course the sufficient energy capacity to facilitate a just transition within the automotive space. Share a few, I guess, highlights and recommendations and learnings that we perhaps might be able to learn and implement here in South Africa, and maybe even opportunities for us to leapfrog some of those developments and avoiding some of the initial mistakes that might have taken place there.
Sure, and sorry, charging infrastructure, that's really the chicken and egg dilemma, because when you think about it, drivers want availability of charging infrastructure, ideally wherever they drive. And if that's not granted, EV popularity and adoption remains limited. And then on the other hand, charge point operators, so we call them CPOs, they want to make a healthy return on their investment. And if the charging demand is low, if EV adoption is low, they don't want to invest into the charging infrastructure. So chicken and egg. So if we don't get this right from the beginning, and yes, South Africa and other parts of the world can learn from Europe a lot there, I believe. If this chicken and egg wouldn't be sorted right, it would be the end of e-mobility before it even starts. And for me, regulation and policy, and don't get me wrong, I'm a free market thinker, right? But I believe that subsidies that we have mentioned in this conversation already numerous times, they are so essential to really kickstart the electric engine, to play a little bit with buzzwords here. Because when you think about it, the business case of charging infrastructure, and business case is obviously something that is key for any profitability focused investor who is required to build the charging ecosystem for e-mobilists to be able to travel and to use the car. So the business case is driven by utilization. And in the beginning of the generation of or birth of this new ecosystem in a region, the utilization is by default low because there are simply not yet enough cars on the road that would really generate sales of electricity, of electrons at the charging point. So in order to make the deal sweet, to sweeten the deal for the investors, subsidies, in my opinion, and we've learned that in Europe, are really key to kickstart the engine and to make the break-even point for an investment, move it into a more attractive zone, or maybe even to secure it for some infrastructure that by nature wouldn't be profitable at all then. So we need subsidies both on the charging infrastructure side and on the EV side. But I think on the charging infrastructure side, it's sometimes even more important because it lays the groundwork for everything. So we can learn from Europe there. And in Germany, I think last week only there was an announcement that they're going to cut or reduce significantly by, I believe, 50% more or less, not maybe for all models, but for some models. They want to reduce subsidies for the purchase of e-vehicles from January 23, so very soon onwards. And why is that? Because the subsidies and everything have led the market to a point where there is healthy demand for vehicles, where there is already a healthy enough, I say enough because it's not enough yet, but healthy enough first level of infrastructure there. So we can already see that after this short time of subsidies, German government is already reducing it because they don't need it anymore. When you look at the order books of the OEMs, they're full. They can't produce more cars. They can sell, but I think it works. So subsidies, I think they really work to kickstart the engine, and that is something that I can only recommend countries who want to reach the exponential part of the curve very quickly, and shorten the hockey stick when you talk about this curve model. That does work.
Definitely. And I think you're pointing to something so interesting. So I guess, a lot more activity taking place within Germany, and really speaks to some examples we can speak to. You wanted to add something there?
Yeah, so I think that's a great input from the global perspective. And I think, when we look at South Africa's case, EVs were full electric vehicles started in 2013. But as we see that growth coming into play, so was our, charging infrastructure from that perspective. But important to note in terms of, as fellow panelists highlighted, is the utilization model changes within that. The key thing within this is to note that, up to 70 to 80% of EV charging actually takes place at home. And this is what we need, the shift in the market, even for consumers, to understand this is what is the utilization on EVs. But coming back into where do we stand in South Africa. So as we see the market slowly growing in terms of that, we're seeing currently South Africa is well positioned from an infrastructure network, public infrastructure in the country as well. Yeah. So internationally, some of the ratios is typically 18 to 20 EVs for one charging station. In developed markets, South Africa is currently 8 in terms of that. So we currently have a good infrastructure network established on the ground for the vehicles in the country as well. So just in terms of that. And I think on the incentives note, what's important to note, you've got the financial incentives, but also the non-financial incentives that come into play. So, this is also a dynamic to also consider that, South Africa and other African countries to take into considerations where government does not have the financial reserves to incentivize financially uptake and subsidies from that perspective as well.
Definitely. And I think that's so important, especially when it comes to cultivating an environment for increased demand from a local point of view, and for developing economies overall, who themselves have been really driving to actively participate in a just transition. Harold, I'm keen to come back to you here, and of course, perhaps referencing some of the points and insights that we do see from the PwC report as to how it is that we do continue to cultivate demand, and maybe some lessons that you can share that might apply to a market specifically like South Africa, where again, our public transport system is, I guess, a mixed bag, depending on which province and which outcomes it is that you look at. And of course, ensuring that the culture as well of this sharing economy, so with e-hailing services, perhaps might also work as a key proponent to ensuring that we actively drive local demand for EV vehicles. Your thoughts?
Well, I think we all agree that electromobility needs to be inclusive, right, in order to actually serve its full purpose. And one thing I think we need not forget is the fact that why has everybody been pushed? Why has the automotive industry been pushed into the disruptive change towards electromobility? It's because of the people finally becoming serious about the fact that we need to do something about making mobility sustainable, right, and preserving our planet. So, and with that, I think it's an imperative to make electromobility available for all parts of society. Otherwise, we're gonna not achieve this basic objectives. One thing, I want to relieve some of the burden that, currently has been put on the governments and, the incentives that they, ought to contribute to make things happen, right? There is other parties that contribute to the market making, right? Like the capital markets, like the NGOs, like policymakers, right? And I think if you compose a nice mix of all these players and have them play together nicely in a well-orchestrated way, right? I think it doesn't even take all that much of the government money in order to make things happen. So when you now look at, and that coming back to your question, forgive me my detour. Coming back to your original question, I think in virtually all the markets, we see much more demand than supply at this point in time. Right? All the order books are full, profits are bursting through the roof as a result of that. But this is going to change if we get things right. And then this will mean strain on the OEMs and, a strain on their profit pools, right? Because electromobility and the business model associated with that is going to be entirely different, right? So, and therefore the OEMs are looking at ways of cutting out current players in the distribution system, right? They are very seriously moving towards direct sales models, agency sales models, where they ultimately have the direct link into the customer and the relationship with the customer. And probably even more so important to them, the direct access to the data of the customer that the customer produces throughout the life cycle of the OEM customer interaction, right? And when you look at the leading electric vehicle players, right, they effectively operate online sales only because the people currently buying EVs are tech-savvy people and they prefer doing things hassle-free, real-time, whenever they like. And I think this ease of the process is ultimately going to help increase the distribution and the popularity of the EVs in every market around the world.
Definitely. And some key lessons to actually grow and develop from there. As you say, demand is present. We just need to make sure that we beef up the supply. And I think that really brings us to the context of what it is we're trying to unpack here this morning, making sure that we are actively ready and participating and implementing the necessary changes to meet up with the supply, but incorporating investment in people, investment in the necessary infrastructure, and having the right policies and incentives in place from a government's point of view. We've got about 3 minutes before we wrap up this panel discussion. And of course, a reminder to our audience members that we will have a Q&A session. So if you do have any pressing questions, perspectives you'd like to share, do type them into the chat box and we will address them in just a moment with several of our panelists. But as we draw concluding remarks from each of our panelists, I'd like us to bring it back to the stakeholders that we are speaking to today and the role and function that they serve in actively participating in this journey to transitioning and participating in the value chain as we move towards EV. Gailo, I'd like to start with you. Your closing message and I guess considerations that OEMs and of course key stakeholders on the call today need to be mindful of as to what role they should consider serving as we participate in this transition. What are some of the considerations, or maybe just one, that we do need to not only keep in mind, but to implement from today going onwards to make sure that we don't miss out on this opportunity?
Invest. The best time to invest in e-mobility was yesterday. The second best time is today. So I think we need to see our 7 OEMs in South Africa really embark on the journey in collaboration with government. There was a green paper published last year by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. There's an upcoming white paper that's going to hopefully get published this year that should really highlight the policy framework for e-mobility in the country. Based on that, hopefully we will have the right conditions for investment and to position South Africa not as the 21st largest manufacturer in automotive, but much higher in that list.
I'm challenging it to say top 10. So you're right. Put your money where your mouth is. And of course, maybe shift it to top 10. Harold, your closing views in 30 seconds or less?
Yes. So I would focus on the opportunities for South Africa, right? Manufacturing is going to change going forward, right? EV vehicles are being manufactured differently. And in this process, different talent is needed, right? And there is different ingredients going into a vehicle, right? And I think South Africa is nicely positioned in order to cater to the different needs that actually will reside in manufacturing of vehicles going forward.
Fantastic. Heiko, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we have to remind ourselves every now and then, why do we do this whole thing, right? I mean, in the end, we don't just do it to get new cars on the street. We do that to decarbonize the planet and to secure that this planet, this beautiful planet we live on, will also continue to exist in the way we want it to exist for future generations. At the same time, we, as part, stakeholders in the ecosystem, want to make money. We want to create value for the society and for our companies that we work in. So I believe, there are so many case studies in the world. Meanwhile, e-mobility is not that new anymore, that we can learn from and really make it work for the follower markets like South Africa. And then at the same time, we have to think about what's next, because, e-mobility is a huge opportunity for new business models. It lays the groundwork for renewable energies because it acts as decentralized storage. Many questions you can ask us in the Q&A, but it's exciting times and we should just go for it and learn from each other and think sustainably.
And that multiplier effect is something that we definitely need in an economy like South Africa. Job creation, active economic inclusion as well of new sectors of the economy. Hiten, you've got the tough task of already having driven this initiative, but what is it that stakeholders need to implement and hit the ground running on?
Yeah, so I think, it really relies on inclusivity of all stakeholders. Government have got a role, industry's got a role in terms of that. But what's key is taking South Africa forward on the opportunities for new energy vehicles. And I think that's what it is. The work that NAMSA is doing and other stakeholders as well is bringing everybody together so that South Africa can transition towards a future in terms of that. Achieving our National Development Plan, achieving our South African Automotive Master Plan. This is how we can really take South Africa forward. Yeah. And conversations like these and the events coming up as well are critical in taking that forward, because there is a huge opportunity for South Africa to unpack, not only economically, but also from a job creation, because there's reports out of the Europe that show up to 1 million jobs to be created across the value chain for electric mobility. So this is what we need to really unpack forward and look at South Africa's challenges where we see today, but taking those into opportunities and really catapulting our automotive sector and the people of South Africa as well alongside that journey.
Speaking to policies and, of course, a sector that is locally relevant, but also globally competitive as we speak to themes like ESG, the National Development Plan as well, but, of course, SDGs, which also play a part within the outcomes that we're looking to achieve here. So lots that we've tried to cover in the last 40 minutes, but, of course, we're looking forward to your participation in our Q&A section in just a moment. So quickly type them through. We'll be sure to address them with our panelists who will join us and stay with us for the remainder of the conversation. But as we give you an opportunity just to stretch your legs, maybe grab a glass of water, do be sure to come back as we are going to take a quick look at NAMSA's first ever South African Auto Week. As highlighted, it's taking place in October. We are very excited to see it happening. And from next week, the 1st of September, that's when you can log on to the website to get more details. But if you're wondering what this inaugural event will entail, let's take a look at this quick video.
I am the heartbeat of an industry, the champion of world-leading brands and everything they stand for. I am pride, I am passion, I am history and heritage. The vision of bold minds that dared to dream. The robust custodian of all that has gone before and all that will follow. I am an economic force, standing tall as one of the biggest contributors in the manufacturing sector. I'm a globally admired player who creates prosperity for industry stakeholders and for the communities I serve. For almost 9 decades, I have towered on a foundation of trust and shared purpose, guiding, collaborating, transforming, delivering consistent performance, adding real value to the partners I represent and the millions of lives they touch every day. I am pioneering leaders and spirited workers, brave in conception, bold in execution. I make a global contribution with locally manufactured products, fostering sustainability and diversity and success in the marketplace. I am the redefinition of mobility, the convergence of connectivity and electrification and changing customer needs. I'm the bridge that builds cohesion, the beacon that lights the path to tomorrow. I am reimagining the future of the automotive industry so that together we can stand proud under the bold and steadfast banner of a stronger and powerful industry voice. I am NAMSA, the Automotive Business Council.
Well, what a beautiful reminder of the sector that it is that we're building and contributing to, and of course the radical aspects of transformation that we're trying to derive from how it is that we impact society and communities, the driving experience in itself, and of course how it is that the economy literally has its aspects, varying aspects attached to the dynamism of the automotive space. Well, do keep your thoughts coming and of course your feedback and sharing your contribution to the conversation. For the moment though, as promised, we're going to give you a quick 5-minute comfort break, but do be sure not to go too far away. Keep this link open, keep the page open, and of course in a moment we'll be back to address your Q&A questions. A reminder, of course, that we are leading our way to the inaugural SA Automotive Week, and any questions and insights you'd like to have can be addressed here. We'll see you in a moment in the next 5. Well, thanks for staying with us as we've come back from our comfort break. And for many of you, you're well aware that we just wrapped up our panel discussion, but of course, extending it further with engagement from many of you as our audience members. And boy, oh boy, have we established that you have all participated with a great sense of excitement in our engagement. There's a lot of questions that have come through. And I must say it's refreshing and encouraging to see that as key stakeholders and participants, many of us are keen to fully understand how it is that we navigate this road ahead of us and really ensure that we're best positioned to take full advantage of the opportunities that exist to improve not only our manufacturing capacity in South Africa, improving demand dynamics globally and locally, and ensuring that the supply chain is able to assist with this transition. So thank you so much for all of you for sending in your questions. A reminder that there are quite a few that will be addressed within our second webinar as we build up to South Africa's Automotive Week. So do be mindful that if any of your questions don't get addressed here today, we will make time to answer them more directly in the upcoming webinar. And of course, looking forward to engaging you and hearing from the various speakers at Automotive Week. Well, a few questions that we've got to get through now within the next 12 minutes or so. And I'm going to pick up on the first one, which underscores and speaks to the overriding theme of what it is that we're trying to establish here today, how it is that an economy like South Africa can ensure that it is best positioned to participate within the EV transition. And Galo, perhaps I'll address this first question to you. The question asks, are there any plans for government to offer support in purchasing EVs? And I guess this is both from a local and international point of view to ensure that we beef up demand in the ecosystem. Galo, your response?
Yes, that's the million-dollar question.
If it's a really flashy sports car, then it's easier to sell, right? But just as long as it does speak to the energy dynamics we require.
Look, the discussions are ongoing at the moment on that very topic, on how to best structure the incentive framework for to support the market for EVs. So there's a whole suite of potential options that are being considered, and certainly one of them is to look at a direct allowance or sort of subsidy for buyers. In our work, we've made a case actually for a direct subsidy to buyers of entry-level EVs. And we think that would be the best way to do that. It basically almost pays for itself in increased sales and taxes and so forth. But of
in
course,
line with international best practice.
Yes, but of course the fiscus is limited, and the negotiations are underway at the moment to see that. As I mentioned, I think previously, it's quite important that we also look at the public transport market and that we incentivize our minibus taxi industry to transition. We already have an incentive in place for them to renew vehicles. We could cater that as well so that they get a bigger subsidy to buy minibus taxis, I guess. So yeah, discussions are underway. I think we've got some great chances of seeing some incentives coming in the near future. But like everything in policy, it moves at its own pace and is a compromise at the end. So let's watch the space.
Definitely. Thanks for touching on the incentives on public transport as well. It does speak to a question and an example that references Cape Town's Golden Arrow bus operators who are slowly embracing and transitioning as well to fully electric buses. So as highlighted, it seems as though a greater amount of incentives might be required there in order to bolster a significant uptick in terms of demand. Hiten, I'll throw this next question at you first, and of course focusing on the South African environment before we look at some of the global dynamics. But one question asks here, what sort of opportunities are OEMs looking to make in terms of changing their production lines into manufacturing of EV vehicles? And secondly, where does this leave the current ICE workforce in terms of these changes?
Yeah, so I think, when you're looking in the manufacturing environment, that's well planned, and there's an architecture towards that. So literally the production lines can manufacture any type of vehicle.
Okay.
The body is common, the rest of the vehicle is common. Whatever powertrain just fits in there specific per order from that perspective. In South Africa specifically, we had local manufacturing in 2018 from one of the OEMs locally already, within that, and that's where a lot of that work and planning in that. Another OEM joined last year as well into that mix as well. So we're seeing that transition. I think when we look at it, one of the opportunities is Sub-Saharan Africa is endowed with the minerals for battery production. In the earlier panel discussion, we said that supply is the challenge. And again, when we look at that, unpack that further, it is the bottleneck of battery production. So if you're looking at, from that perspective, this is what is the opportunity in closing that gap from that perspective. And I think within the whole challenges and dynamics from the vehicle manufacturers, there's a clear strategy in every brand to electrify. And I think that's where it is. So we need to take those global strategies into South Africa, bring it here, and transition with the OEMs and the component industry alongside that. But certainly technology is not the problem.
Yeah.
We just need to develop the market and supply chains from that perspective. But that is the opportunity to unpack for that as well.
Got you. Quick one as a follow-up on skills. Does it change anything in terms of staff who are capacitated within the vehicle manufacturing space?
So yeah, I think from a vehicle manufacturing perspective, no, not within that, because from a manufacturing assembly point of view, a component, that's how it's handled from that perspective. The skills perspective will be transferred to the supply chain from that perspective as well. But yes, there is upskilling required from that perspective. And I think that's the important thing. We need to look at the jobs component and skills perspective. There's a shift. While we might see a slowdown in certain skills, there's really an acceleration in different skill sets required from that. And that's the trade-off from that. And that's the important thing.
Got you on that one, at least guaranteeing a greater sense of no job losses, but rather creation of any others within the various sectors. Heiko, I'd like to address this next one to you, which does speak to some more global themes that come to mind. And this question from one of our participants asks, has EVs been certified as long-term sustainable solution, or will it be replaced by another technology within a few years? For example, hydrogen. Your perspective there, Heiko? And Harold, feel free to jump in if you've got some further feedback.
I mean, we don't know how the futures, how the technologies will develop in the future. And when you think about it, I mean, hydrogen, you can always generate. You just need electricity for it. However, based on the technology as we see developing today, we believe battery electric mobility, and we talked about it earlier, should be the first choice. On the other hand, and I think that is more significant for the midterm and actually longer term future for the next 20 years or so, we see that political decisions have been made. So investment will be channeled into this ecosystem, and it would not be sustainable to significantly invest billions and billions of dollars into new infrastructure and then not use it. I mean, that would not be the idea of circular economy and sustainable business. So I believe it's also, we have to make sure we get the most out of the investments we are doing now, that the world is embarking onto now. And then obviously continue to invest into other alternative technologies, into hydrogen, into e-fuels, etc., and see how the mix can be the sustainable one. So I believe personally, there is space for more than just one technology, especially as different use cases have different technological requirements. I believe optimizing the mix and battery electric mobility will, in my opinion, play a very strong role in that mix. Optimizing that mix is key to really maximize sustainability on the long term.
Interesting views. Harold?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, right? When you just look at the different use cases that we already see right now, right? When you look at trucks, for example, batteries are not really an option for trucks, right? This is why people are thinking much more about hydrogen solutions there. But I couldn't agree more with Heiko. I think we should not be concerned that battery electric vehicles and the associated infrastructure are just a short or midterm solution to the question of mobility. I think it's going to be around for the vast majority of mobility options for the foreseeable future, and that should not hinder any doubts in this should not hinder us to pursue that full steam ahead.
Got you on that one. And I think a great segue for us, I'm not too sure if you wanted to contribute there again, Heiko, but if not, I'll come back to Hitten, because there is an opportunity for us to use that example and localize it from a South African point of view. And Hitten, this question from one of our participants asks, should South Africa consider hybrid vehicle technology, or should they just target fully electric vehicles directly? Which is a great build-up from what we're hearing from both Harold and Hitten, Harold and Heiko, in terms of diversifying our options from a South African point of view.
Yeah, so I think it's twofold. The manufacturers will introduce the product roadmap from that perspective. So moving from ICEs to hybrid electric and then battery electric from that perspective. But interesting in what happened in the South African market. In 2019, we had a shift moving from plug-in hybrid electric vehicles to full battery electric. And that was interesting because it's twofold. Consumers had better confidence in the technology. And secondly, there was wider offering in terms of range on full battery electric vehicles from the manufacturers coming to the market. So we're seeing that change from that perspective. And obviously with development of infrastructure, we're seeing, that playing a better role to support uptake of battery electric vehicles. So I think it's just a bridger from that. But I think a lot, especially where we stand today, technology available, the range available, and really the driving pleasure of full battery electric.
Yeah.
You can literally leapfrog straight into that. I think specific consumer needs, affordability as well. Hybrid will be the bridge, but really from a product offering, battery electric vehicles are certainly on what's available today and can solve a lot of opportunities for that, as well as the future.
Definitely. Yeah. Speaking of, the buildup of the hybrid model and, of course, opportunities that might exist, there's another question here that maybe you can speak to, Hitten, which asks, what is the current situation with the EV infrastructure? Are we on schedule for 2030, which is a deadline for some of the targets we have?
Yeah, so when we look at 2030 and where we need to go, so I briefly touched on it earlier from an infrastructure perspective. We're currently well positioned from that perspective. As the curve picks up from products being introduced into the market, our infrastructure needs to grow in terms of that. But I think also from a maturity perspective, pricing on solar has come down, pricing on batteries has come down. So we see from an energy supply and energy security perspective, pricing is there, the business models are there, coupling, storage and renewable energy together with mobility is driving a new business, and even including the OEMs moving into energy businesses from that perspective. So I think that's what is there, from that perspective. And going to 2030, this is where South Africa needs to play its cards in terms of how we're going to move that perspective there. But I think it's very interesting from what we see, the opportunities that lie, and I think we need to take advantage of that. Yeah. And I think what Gayla also alluded to is the updated policy frameworks will really drive some opportunities within the South African environment so that we can really achieve the plans set out there from a policy perspective and, economic and social development.
Definitely. Themes that are required and, of course, propelling our growth and development. To segue and pick up on that policy perspective that you highlighted, and Gaylo, coming back to you on this one, again, speaks to policy. And, of course, South Africa is an environment with its own nuances. And this question asks, how do you think BBBE changes will impact on localization of electric vehicles? We do not have skills in South Africa, which makes building EVs in South Africa unfeasible. So someone with a different view in terms of skills from what we heard from Hitten. But Gaylo, maybe if you can unpack the role, function and changes in BBBE, and of course just addressing the skills challenge once again, which appears to be heavy on the minds of a few investors.
Yeah, I think I share Ethan's view there. I think in terms of on the skills, I think we've got really a great pool of skills in the country, and certainly that's not, in my mind, the main hindering factor. We've got 7 OEMs, well-developed value chains. Even if you look at the battery value chain, we actually have a really healthy ecosystems of companies already assembling battery in South Africa, making all the components with the exception of the battery cell, and exporting those. So we have a gigantic amount of skills already into the system. The question is whether we can retain those skills going forward. I think where it does put a bit of pressure, particularly in terms of the BE requirements, is to attract the new investors, particularly when they have specific technologies. And when we have, particularly around battery technologies, if we were to want to go big on battery manufacturing into South Africa, we would need a foreign partner to do that, most likely. That makes it slightly more complicated in terms of the BE requirements, but effectively, these are requirements that the industry is well versed in navigating, and I think has the capacity to do that. So I think we just need to manage it slightly carefully as we transition, particularly, because they are to benefit from the APDP framework. There are some goals to be achieved, particularly in terms of employment level and so forth. So I think we need just to manage that carefully as we transition to electric mobility, but nothing that, in my mind, can't be managed successfully.
I like that. Solutionist thinking. Nothing that is too much of a challenge for us to overcome. And I think really important and refreshing that we underscore the opportunity that does exist. Harold, I see you smiling, and I think we'd like to close off with you very briefly within the next 30 seconds. We've heard about the optimism from a South African point of view. Government policies are coming on board. Businesses are keen to invest, though they do have some questions. And of course, some aspects that they do need to transition within their model. So from a South African point of view, locally and domestically, we're optimistic, slightly anxious, but still eager to participate. But sometimes we need to hear the voice of international partners and peers that might assist in propelling us in positioning, as we heard, not just from number 21, but hopefully a lot lower down that list and featuring in the top 10 of being a real competitive market. Closing it off for us, why is South Africa and its automotive space critical to the global force from your perspective? And of course, a sense of optimism that you can leave with our stakeholders here today to actively participate in this opportunity going forward.
I think there is all reason to be optimistic in South Africa to not only maintain its position in the industry, in the global industry, but even to advance in its position, right? So I think with the change that goes into the manufacturing process, into the product, right, and the capabilities that you can bring to the table, I think there is no reason why you should not significantly benefit from it, right? When we think about the battery element of the electric vehicle, but then there is the value pool of software as well, right? Where there is significant level of employment to be achieved there too, right? So I think all in all, no reason to be not optimistic. It's just about properly analyzing what is needed in the respective business models, in the value chains, and finding the sweet spots that are tailor-made for South Africa, because there are, I think, very many.
Definitely. Well, we like that. Clearly, if you're not with us on this journey, you're definitely losing out. And that's what we're looking to drive, to actively participate in this global transition and opportunity to move towards EVs. As we wrap up our Q&A session, this does bring us to the end of today's webinar as we look to draw on concluding points and themes and insight that have been shared. Of course, I'd like to start off by thanking my panelists and all the key speakers who actively participated in sharing their global thoughts, research, insight, and of course, industry views as to how best it is that South Africa can position itself within this global arena of participating in EVs. We've got the confidence of the global community. We too have our own capabilities and support. Now it's just a matter of implementing the right solutions that are being discussed in these webinars and of course that will be addressed in the upcoming SA Automotive Week. Once more, thank you for joining us for this particular conversation. Thank you to our panelists as well, Heiko, Harold, of course not forgetting Hitten and Galo, who've joined us, giving us some insight, and of course will be key participants as we build up to SA Automotive Week. Before we get there in October, a reminder that the website will be launched officially next week on the 1st of September, and on the 20th of September, we'll have our second webinar where we'll be engaging on the local fundamentals that we need to address to ensure that our automotive industry is best positioned for these opportunities. Until then, keep the engines running. The The steering wheel is held steadily and in control, heading us into the right direction. And most importantly, we need to get those tires moving, leading us onto a greater journey of prosperity and of course, the great economic outcomes that will derive for South Africa, for South Africans, and the global economy overall. Thank you so much for joining us today. Until next time, take care.
Electric vehicle, global megatrends.
In 2020, global electric car stock numbered 10 million.
Battery electric vehicles accounted for 2/3 of new electric cars.
Europe overtook China as the biggest market.
Today, several governments provide incentives for EV purchases.
18 of the 20 largest original equipment manufacturers are increasing their EV offerings.
Electric bus and truck registrations are expanding in major markets.
Electric heavy-duty vehicle models are broadening.
Installation of publicly accessible chargers is growing.
Welcome to Elevate, Mobility Reimagined, where we'll explore what a successful and attractive South African automotive sector looks like.